Hello folks. I'd like to continue this conversation talking about the Enclave Act, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, and the Property Clause. You know, there are people out there that are perfectly fine with the fact that certain people have been thrown off their property, like Dwight and Stephen Hammond. And I failed to mention them in my last video clip, and I apologize for that. But you have a 76-year-old man who just got sent to prison for the remainder of 5 years, which is something like 4 years and 9 months. His property is being stolen, his ranch is being stolen with these excessive fines. He's been denied his constitutional rights. He was resentenced after being sentenced previously, which to me is double jeopardy. I know there are some people out there who don't agree with that. That's double jeopardy. The Constitution says that you cannot be put in jeopardy of life or property. I think it's life, limb, and property for the same offense twice. Okay, they can call it resentencing, call it whatever they want. And then also there was evidence which would have exonerated Dwight and his son, but was the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney didn't bring it forth. Very, very powerful evidence. That evidence was the fact that the BLM started that fire. They started that fire that caused the Hammonds to start a backfire, all right? And burned 130 acres of what they call BLM land. Never mind the fact that that grass that burned up was actually owned by the Hammonds. They had the grazing rights. That means they own that. It's crazy. It's really nuts. And you know, these fires by ranchers, they do this all the time, and this goes all the way back to the Native Americans, because when these grasses build up to a certain point, they die and they choke off the land. But if you burn them off, that burnt material becomes fertilizer, and it exposes the new growth to sunlight and to water, and the land comes back much more productive for the animals. These are called prescribed burns. And this has been going on forever, okay? When I lived in Montana, many times in the Beaverhead County, I'd wake up in the morning, I was wondering what in the world was going on, because it was really hazy and smoky, and not being accustomed to this tradition and to this really scientific approach to rebuilding the land. I was confused. I was wondering what the heck was going on. And I had to go to my in-laws, who are very familiar with that sort of thing, and they explained it to me. Okay? So, getting back to what I was talking about, there are so many people that are okay with somebody else's life being destroyed. And that's just one. This happens all over the West. This happens all the time with ranchers and farmers. Okay, raw milk, selling it to their neighbors, or these certain raw foods. There used to be all kinds of mom and pop markets, roadside mom and pop markets when I was growing up. We would drive through southern Utah there, and there'd be these little roadside markets, and they'd be selling produce. They'd be selling, and that produce would be fresh fruits and vegetables, and it'd be other things like nuts and jerky, and you know, it was really common, and it was common throughout the United States. And these big corporations have lobbied for laws to put an end to all that. And you know, there was people that were dependent upon that at one time. In southern Nevada, there used to be 52 ranchers in Clark County, Nevada. There's 51 now. The 51 were all put out of business by the BLM. What happened to those people? What happened to their families? You have the same thing going on in Nye County with the Hage Ranch. The federal government's doing all they can to put them out of business and to destroy them. These are livelihoods. You know, if you just look at the livelihoods of those people that are being destroyed, but there's other things to look at too. Ultimately, the food source is being destroyed. The land is actually being destroyed. It's being totally mismanaged. And yet there are people that don't get that. But they do understand. They've got to understand that people's lives are being destroyed. And they're okay with it. Joseph Robertson up there in Montana. That's probably the most amazing of all. This is by the EPA. The EPA filed these criminal charges. And the federal government did not allow evidence in that court that would exonerate Joseph Robertson. Very, very powerful evidence by one individual in particular, worked for the Army Engineers, and that was his job. And he said there's no way those stock ponds on his property could have ever contaminated any water, let alone a river 60 miles away. You know, it's crazy. It's a stock pond. I lived in Montana for some time, and there are stock ponds all over the West. And some of those stock ponds were later planted, are planted with fish, and you can go in and fish them. They're stock ponds. They're planted by the Department of Fish and Game, and it's open to the public. They are stock ponds. I mean, they are all over the place, and they are not subject to EPA laws, according to the EPA's own laws. So now you have a new push. Private property, okay? No due process. They call it due process. What a joke when they will not allow credible scientific evidence that would exonerate this man. You see what's happening here? It's getting worse and worse all the time. And there is an agenda there. I'm not sure what the agenda in that particular area is all about, why that judge did that. And then the judge gets up and after sentencing Joseph Robertson, he mocks and degrades the people that were there supporting him and lies through his teeth. You know, this judge is a liar. This judge is brought out of retirement for this very purpose. That's it. That he could slam this man. That he could destroy this man and hand down a kangaroo ruling. Okay? A kangaroo court. That's all it is. When this happens, people, we don't have justice anymore. All right? So, you know, getting back to the Enclave Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, and what's in there, in the enumerated powers in the 9th and 10th Amendment, the enumerated powers given to Congress, that's an Enclave Clause. There's only 18 spending privileges there. That's it. They are enumerated, and that's it. They don't get any more power than that, according to the Constitution of the United States. And then it says all rights and privileges and powers that are not given to the government are retained by the people, retained by the states and the people respectively. So how in the world does anybody come up with this distorted understanding of the property clause? Because, you know, history shows we got 200 years of precedence. We have 38 states of precedence that cannot be ignored or denied. Exactly how the statehood was given, the sovereignty of the state, and in regards to and considering preemptive rights, prior appropriation, that included indigenous peoples, that included foreign countries, okay? And these rights were carried over after the state became sovereign. So this interpretation that Congress makes these rules that even after these lands are disposed of, that they continue to have power and authority over these lands, and that they delegated this power and authority to the BLM and the Forestry Service. That is insane, because you look at the end result of this interpretation, and these natural resources are denied to the states, and these states will eventually run into a dead end. Okay, this is one of the reasons why the economy is failing so badly, because we don't have access to our natural resources. This is one of the reasons that in the western states, many of these states are losing population. The jobs aren't there. Without natural resources, you don't have industry. If you don't have industry, you don't have jobs. If you don't have jobs, people got to go elsewhere. And there's a side note to this whole thing. For example, in cities like Las Vegas, you have a lot of young girls that come here from Utah, Montana, Idaho, and they get into this industry. Most of them start off as cocktail waitresses because there's some really good money to be made there, no doubt. All right, but it's subtle. To me, it's subtle prostitution, and I don't actually mean that in a bad way, believe it or not. But a lot of these young girls can't handle it. They really can't handle it, and they get involved in things way worse, way worse. And all you have to do is drive around certain aspects of Las Vegas, certain places of Las Vegas, and you see that there. And there's been some big articles written on it, where these young girls come from and what happens to them. And because they lose the support of their families, and they don't want to talk to their families what kind of work they're involved with. They lie to their parents what they're actually doing. And they don't have that. They're still too young to stand on their own 2 feet and not get into trouble. Their ego is being stroked by a lot of rich men, and they end up, like I said, they end up getting bought. When you get right down to it, that's what happens. Whereas if they would have had the opportunity for jobs, good jobs, in their home states, they would be there with their families and be under the protection and care of wiser people, their parents, their grandparents, who are much wiser to the ways of the world. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. That's just a side note to this whole thing that I have been aware of. It's been made public. You actually have this group called Christians for Ex-Prostitutes, something like that, to really try to help these young girls. And they have put out a lot of information, and there's some video clips of it also. But you know, that's one of those things that gets buried. You know, the state of Nevada, actually I shouldn't say so much the state of Nevada, but Las Vegas and Reno, they want to bury that. They want to bury that. You know, it's a tourist attraction. But then you get into the, you know, the other aspect to this whole thing, the seedy, dark aspect to this whole thing, where these young people's lives are being ruined and destroyed. And it's not just young girls, it's young men also. There's a lot of homosexual prostitutions, gay prostitutions, young men. And their lives are destroyed to a great extent. They eventually get into drugs and overdose, or they just go downhill from there. Okay, there's enough of that. So let's get back to, for example, prior appropriations. I always talk about this San Francisco 49ers. And see, California didn't become a state until after the 1849, when all the miners went out there and staked their claims. And those claims were recognized as prior appropriations. Those rights, those claims were appropriated. Now, there's two ways of looking at this, and I think the more correct way is that they're appropriated by prior, not necessarily by becoming to a state, prior to becoming a state, but it was a priority, all right. And because it was a priority, it was appropriated. And I think I misspoke on that before, but it was appropriated prior before it became a sovereign state, and it carried over once it became a sovereign state. All right, and there was a whole lot of different things that are prior appropriation. Homestead Act, which it ended up quadrupling and even more because of the lack of water, for example, in the state of Nevada. Grazing rights, water rights, rights of indigenous people. I've talked about the Basque. The Basque they came from Spain. They originally came to the state of Nevada for mining, for gold mining. And they were young people, and they came here to make their fortune, and go back and get married and have families because it was so difficult in their homeland of Spain. They got into the state of Nevada and California, and then they decided that, for the most part, as a collective, they decided that it was more beneficial for them to become sheep herders. There's just all this land that was out there, and they had a tremendous amount of sheep running in the state of Nevada, and like I say, and also in California, but primarily the state of Nevada. They're pretty famous in the state of Nevada, but they never intended to stay, so they never put their claims in. All right, unless some of them did stay, and some later became ranchers, and they did have some claims, but for the most part, they never did put their claims in. Okay, and they forever relinquished those rights, and they understood that. So that's one where they failed to put in their claims of these lands, these unappropriated lands, and they forever lost their claims. Is that hard to understand? It shouldn't be hard for anybody to understand. When Congress would look at these lands, for example, let's take the Guadalupe, Hidalgo, the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, and that was after the Mexican-American War, and we end up with a whole lot more land than we originally went to war for, which was Texas. And we end up signing a treaty and end up more or less paying Mexico $15 million for these lands. Well, out of that treaty, we've got enough land to have the state of New Mexico, the state of Arizona, the state of Nevada, and I believe that's it. Maybe a little bit of some other states there. And so you have this big territory, all right? And Congress has the responsibility to divide this territory up into states. And there's a whole lot of considerations. One of them I just talked about, are the ones I just talked about, prior appropriations. And, you know, if it was a foreign country that had any claims on these lands, they were paid for those lands. A real good one is Russia and the Louisiana Purchase. But Russia and Alaska and the Louisiana Purchase, that they actually paid these foreign lands, these foreign countries off for these lands, because it was a lot better than going to war with them. So that's in one case what would be considered prior appropriations. So, and then you had your equal footing clause, that when they were to bring a state into the Union out of these territories, they wanted to come in on an equal footing. And one of the number one considerations was natural resources. And out of that, those natural resources, the number one consideration was water. Because without water, you really don't have any way that these lands can be settled ultimately. And especially in a beneficial way, all right? Where the land is put under cultivation. And then under the Equal Footing Clause and the Enabling Act, once these lands had a borders, you know, come up with some borders, then the states had to get their own state legislature. They had to have their own state constitution. They had to have their own law enforcement, which at the time was sheriffs. And really it's the only thing constitutionally that is actually truly allowed. Everything else is really, by our founding forefathers, was considered a standing army, right? And there was other things too, set up their post office box, which the Enclave Act provided for, forts, magazines, arsenals, because a lot of this land was unsettled, and you still had what they call renegade indigenous peoples that had not put in any claims. You had those that did, and they formed treaties and then those treaties became reservations. Now those things would never be controlled by the states, but always controlled by Congress. All right. So, but you still had roving bands of Native Americans that were hostile. They were hostile to this whole idea. So you had forts that were established for the protecting of the pioneers. So Congress had an awful lot to consider, and it really wasn't easy. And but they wanted to have an equal footing for every state coming into the United States, and it was also to protect the existing states. So I've gone over this numerous times, and now we have this really gross interpretation of the Property Clause, the Enabling Act, the Enclave Clause. You know, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. All anyone has to do is go back in history and see how all this stuff was taken care of in the past. I mean, if the federal government wanted a property anywhere, they always proposed to the state legislature, and the state legislation had to approve it, and they would come up with a dollar amount, and then the federal government would pay for it, and they would get title and deed to that property. And I mean, you can go all over the country and find that scenario all over, everywhere. It's only been in the last few decades that it has changed, where all of a sudden the government is coming to be this beast that thinks they control everything. And it's not, and again, it's just not public lands. It's private property more and more. All the time it's becoming private property through the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, all these things. And again, I say there's people out there that think that's just fine. You have people in states that are not in these western states, and somehow in their mind they think their taxes are paying for the maintenance and upkeep of this land, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. You know, there's the Grace Commission that during the Ronald Reagan, they looked at the taxes that people were paying and to see where they were going, and they had nothing to do with the maintenance or upkeep of these lands. So you have this envious, jealous, needle-nosed people, what I call just do-gooders that have nothing else. They don't have a life. They just want to bitch and complain that somebody's stealing something from them. They see a cow out on the open range in these lands, and they think that cow is eating the grass or doing something that is hurting them in some way. They think these ranchers, because they don't want to pay their taxes to the federal government, they want to pay it to the county. Okay? They think somehow these ranchers are cheating them out of something. Okay? They're called welfare ranchers. They have no idea what these ranchers go through and the time, the effort and trouble they go to actually being good stewards on these lands. They come up with water sources. They enhance the natural water sources for the benefit of all the animals. You know, the birds they like to go watch, and the animals in the wild they like to go watch. Well, guess who's benefiting? Who's providing the water for them? Who's taking care of that land so that that land is productive? These animals will actually have something to eat. Okay? Like I was talking about these prescribed burns that help the deer, that help the elk, that help right on down to the smallest little animal that the predators eat. Okay, they're across the board. There are so much more wildlife because of these ranchers, but that's never taken into consideration by these people that just have nothing to do but sit around and complain and bitch about everything. All right, like I said before, they would be your worst neighbor. You know, I mean, they would drive you out of the neighborhood after a fashion. So I hope you share this video far and wide. I hope people actually take the time to do some research. I want to show you a book here real quick. I don't expect everybody to have books like this. okay? This book was written in 1877, and it's a history of the United States. Going back even prior to that, it was written in 1877. But it gets into these things like the Enclave Clause and the Constitution of the United States and prior appropriations and preemptive rights, which, I mean, it's in the history books. It's in the history of how this was all taken care of. You know, you can find it yourself if you just do a little bit of research. But you read this property clause and you think you understand it right off the bat. And you don't. You really don't. You know, there's a lot of people that do, but these people that are against it, they don't understand it. The word dispose of. The word dispose meant that Congress had to get rid of these lands. They couldn't keep them. The federal government couldn't keep them. And I had put what the word dispose of means. And, you know, if you go into the state of Utah, I had one person that made a comment about the state of Utah property clause, and he left out the most important part. In fact, he changed it. He said this new state forever relinquishes rights to this land. It doesn't say that. It says the proposed state, which means it's still a territory. And it comes under a completely different interpretation. All right? Preemptive rights. Okay. Preemptive rights. First in place, first in time, that is your right. There's only just a handful, or just a couple of requirements. When the pioneers would come out, and they'd come into these states with these vast lands that had not been settled yet. If you made a claim over those lands, there's a couple things you had to do. One is you had to defend your claim. You actually had to defend your claim. All right? And you might have to do that without the help of the federal government. You might have to do that without the help of the cavalry and the forts and the arsenals and, you know, the magazines, all that stuff. So here you'd have a handful of people that might have to fight off aggressors. Okay? The other thing is you had to work the land. You had to make it beneficial. You just couldn't go out and make a claim and walk away from it. It didn't matter if it was a mining claim. It didn't matter if it was a homestead. It didn't matter if it was a mineral claim. You had to work that land and you had to stay there. And that became a preemptive right. And those rights were recorded in that state and in that county under your name. Preemptive rights. And there was a big push. There was a big push to get these lands settled for some very obvious reasons at the time. We were a new country for the most part. Nothing like Europe. I mean, you're going back thousands of years there. So for the most part, we were a new country that was being settled. And you know, if you've got lands out there and you don't have citizens, you don't have pioneers on those lands, you're always vulnerable to a foreign country coming in and taking over those lands. And that was one of the big considerations of Congress. They wanted those lands settled. So these people came out and they did just that. And now today, their descendants are having to fight the government for the rights to those lands that their forefathers settled. And that is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. I think I pretty much covered everything. I'm not screaming. I'm not going crazy this time. But I get very frustrated. Really, really frustrated. Because as of right now, the Bundys and the Patriots are getting ready to come to trial here pretty soon. All right? And the government cannot show title or deed to those lands. They cannot show up there in Oregon in that refuge that they purchased those lands by the consent of the legislature. They can't show it. And they're trying to get the judge to rule that those automatically, that those laws, those lands cannot be disputed as owned by the federal government. And the fact of the matter is, they're not. And they never have been. They went through great length to throw those people off those lands. It started with Teddy Roosevelt. You know, it started with what we call a conservative Republican. And that's why I don't trust what a lot of people call conservative Republicans either. That's where it got started. And there's been over 130 ranchers thrown off that property, off those lands. And the federal government actually flooded many of them out. All right? And the ones that couldn't flood out, they always come up with some scheme. some conniving scheme to get them off the lands. Dwight Hammond's was one of the worst I've ever seen. They just packed the court. They packed the court. They distorted the laws. They did not allow evidence that would have exonerated Dwight and Stephen Hammond, and that was prosecuting attorney Papagni. I mean, this is about as bad as you can get. And they manufactured evidence. They absolutely manufactured evidence, denied them of their rights, and threw them off the property and threw them in prison. So now you have the Patriots that went up there with the Bundys, primarily to defend the Hammonds. And now they are coming up to trial here pretty soon. And the government, in fact, the government's going along instituting secret courts. Wow, this is really, really bad. They're not going to allow the general public into those courts. They're going to have their hand-picked media, mainstream media. They'll have their hand-picked mainstream media, which is owned by George Soros, Rupert Murdoch, and provide this slanted, biased reporting. Now, the Review-Journal has been trying to have access to it, and they're denying them. And the Review-Journal is just recently bought up by Adelson. And interesting enough, he's Jewish, but he's a big Trump supporter, and he's been trying to get his newspaper through the FOIA Act to get this information, to make this information made public. No, people, this is really bad. This is really, really bad, and they're going to railroad. They're going to railroad our patriots. They're going to railroad the Bundys in any way they can. And so this is why I want people to understand exactly what's taken place and what has taken place historically and what has taken place today. Because this is only going to get worse. If we don't stand up, if we don't do something, this is only going to get worse. All right? So it's an education process first and foremost. Second, it's a legislative process with the vote. And that's one reason why I'm telling everybody to vote for Trump. Even though I think he's got his flaws. He's light years ahead of Hillary and that bunch. And I think Trump, as a businessman, understands that you've got to have your natural resources to have industry. Because if you don't have jobs, and you don't have people going to go into his casinos and his hotels and spend money. It's really simple. And then his multi-billion-dollar empire is going to eventually collapse along with everything else. Very simple. I mean, this is not brain surgery. It's not rocket science. It's something that anybody can understand. And as I've also said before, the Constitution was written so that people with an 8th grade education can understand it. Well, I've looked at some of those 8th grade tests, and we have been dumbed down. America's been dumbed down tremendously. An 8th grade test today, I don't know how many college kids could even pass it. And we have been dumbed down. We've been dumbed down in so many different ways. You know, I bring up the fluoride in the water, the vaccinations, the GMO foods, chemtrails, on and on and on. Has reduced the intelligence of this people. And it's put us at the mercy of